Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Managing Microsoft Teams Sprawl with Power Platform. Thank you for taking the time out of your schedules today and being here. I'm Shannon Dougal. I'm the head of marketing at DeFacto, and I have the pleasure of being the host for today's presentation. Today, I'm joined by Richard Burke, DeFacto's Principal Technology Strategist, and Adam Tobias, a Senior SharePoint Consultant at DeFacto, who will be exploring the topics of Microsoft Teams governance and automating Teams creation using tools included in most Office 365 enterprise subscriptions. So without further delay, I'll pass the mic to Richard.
Hey Shannon, and good morning, everybody. What I'm going to do is just walk you through a quick agenda of what we're going to cover today. I'll let you know, the topics we're going to cover and just talk about Teams concerns, concerns about Teams sprawl, and talk about kind of common governance issues that we see when we're looking at Teams. Then Adam's going to give us a very good demo of a self-service solution for Teams and how you can build in some policies and procedures of your governance practice into that solution using the Power Platform. We'll talk about licensing considerations for a solution like that and things you got to think about when you're rolling out something like that, and also think about ways we could possibly extend that demo, with a focus again on governance policies and procedures and how you can actually build some rules and capabilities into a self-service solution. So before I get going, let's just talk about Teams in general and just the growth of Teams over the last 6 months in particular. With the COVID pandemic, we've seen Teams grown by more than 300% in the last 6 months. So there's been tremendous growth on the platform. And what that actually means is we've seen active daily users grow to over 75 million people a day are now using the Teams product. So they're using Teams for meetings and collaboration basically across many organizations. Single day meetings, we've seen participants of up to over 100 million people active on Teams doing meetings. And we're also seeing that 2 out of 3 Teams users are actually interacting with files now on Teams. So they're doing collaboration with content within those teams as well. And we've also seen that video calls on Teams have grown by over 10 times. So there's been tremendous growth on the platform. And I think the key takeaway here is to think about the fact that in your organizations, as people start to adopt Teams, what we've seen a lot of organizations struggle with over the last 6 months is that Teams, the adoption has been very quick. It's been very organic. There hasn't been a great opportunity to think about governance or think about how you want to manage the actual rollout of the Teams platform. And particularly when people are starting to use content, and as you see, there are 2 out of 3 Teams users using content. So that's 50 million people basically worldwide are now using content on the platform. You want to be thinking about how you're going to manage that content, who owns that content, what sort of classification should you have on that content, and just be aware of how that's rolling out across your organization and what kind of controls and policies and procedures you want to think about as your users start to adopt the Teams product itself. So what is a team anyway, first of all? So when we think about what is a Microsoft team, when somebody goes off and creates a team in your organization, what are they actually creating? So if we look at Teams and look at the key workloads that you have in the Teams product, you've got things like chat, you've got the capability to have meetings, you've got collaboration across files, and you've got people using Teams, recording those meetings, and those recordings have been saved. And the key takeaway here is that Microsoft Team, when you spin up a team, it's basically deploying things across a number of services in Microsoft 365. So you've got things going into the Exchange service. Files are being saved into OneDrive and SharePoint, depending on how people are using those files. Recordings are going into the Microsoft Stream. And again, meetings and calendaring and things like that are going into Exchange. And the other thing is to think about is from a Teams perspective is when somebody creates a team, they're creating a group as well in your directory service. So they're creating a Microsoft 365 group. There's going to be owners to that group. There's going to be members of that group. And that group spans the services as well. So it spans Exchange, it spans SharePoint, it spans Stream. And you've got to be aware of the fact that that's basically happening in your tenant as people create new teams. That's rolling out and getting deployed in a number of different services. And if you don't think about how you want to manage that rollout, that can get out of hand over time, basically, and basically leave you with a mess to clean up in the future if you're not careful. So let's talk a quick bit about governance and just think about Teams governance at a very quick level. What is Teams governance? And really, when you think about governance and Teams governance, it's really about providing a well-managed environment for your colleagues to do their jobs. So you want your colleagues and people in your organization to be taking advantage of this product. It's a tremendous product. It's got a lot of great features and capabilities. But you want to think about them getting the best benefit from it, and also making sure that it's basically giving best value for your business as well, and they're using it to very effectively. So first and foremost, when you think about Teams governance, you want to think about what policies and procedures your organization wants to think about when they're rolling out the product, how you want to manage content in there, what sort of things you want to do with that content, how long should teams be around for, do you want to think about things like how they name the team, so stuff like that. Really, you got to think about policies and procedures for that. The challenge with policies and procedures that you create for any governance process that you're going to roll out is that as soon as you roll those out, they're out of date, unfortunately. They get out of date very quickly. And the reason for that is many, because Microsoft might have rolled out some new features. That means you need to go back and reflect on those and actually incorporate those into your policies. Or you'll find more commonly that the business they've got some use cases you didn't consider, and you want to think about how you roll those into your policies and procedures. So a key point about managing governance and managing Teams governance is it's a process that's been constantly refined, and you've got to have processes in place to be refining it all of the time. So it's not something you just set up once as a place people can go and see those policies and procedures. You want to make sure it's something that's constantly evolving and managing as your organization manages and evolves and uses the product itself. With the management of policies and procedures, you want to also think about how you can support those policies and procedures using technology. And that's kind of the key focus of today's webinar, is showing you how you can do things with self-service to do that. Microsoft have also done a great job of giving you some out-of-the-box tools to configure policies and procedures on Teams. So you can kind of look at what, from your organization's perspective, what your requirements are, what you want to worry about from a Team's perspective, and what you get out of the box in terms of configuring those, but then also look at where you need to build some sort of capability yourself in terms of either a manual process or automation with technology to allow those policy and procedures to be enforced as Teams get rolled out and used. And a key point about governance and Teams governance is you want to make sure that what you're doing in terms of your policies and procedures are not getting in the way of your business. So you want to allow your users to basically take advantage of the platform, take advantage of Teams, but also be aware of the policies and procedures, and ideally have those policies and procedures being applied automatically with technology, and also have the capability to actually monitor and get regular reporting on how those policies have been applied and where they're being broken, for example, so you can see what's going on and how people are actually using the product itself, and refine your policies and procedures based off of that. So let's look at common governance issues that we're seeing with Teams. And I've got a few issues here that we've seen over the last couple of years. They're not in any particular order. I just wanted to throw them out here and let you know kind of the sort of stuff that we see happening. And most of these happen really because of either there hasn't been a lot of training that's been delivered, or it's just been rolled out and people have just started adopting it organically. So the first sort of issue that we typically see is team names. People don't give a lot of thought into what makes a good team name. And if you recall a few slides back, we saw that when you create a team, it's actually spinning up stuff in a lot of different services in Office 365. So it's creating a Microsoft 365 group, it's creating a site in SharePoint, it's creating some stuff in Exchange, potentially creating stuff in Stream if you're using other tools like Planner. It's creating things across all of these services. And if people don't give meaningful names to a team, that becomes an issue for usability later for people when they're trying to find teams, and they're trying to figure out what teams they should be members of, or even just trying to discover what teams are in the organization. You also have scenarios where people who are members of teams they're not even aware of what team they're in because they don't really understand what the name means. And to give you an example, we've had a recent client basically had teams rolled out in their organization. They didn't really have a good naming structure put in place. And somebody created a team that was basically the exact same name as an existing distribution group that was rolled out across Exchange. A user on that team saw that they were a member of a new Office 365 group for the team that had the same name. They put a ticket into IT to say, this is duplicated. There's actually two distribution groups set up in my Outlook address book. I don't need to be in one of them. And IT deleted the team Microsoft 365 group inadvertently. So those are the sort of issues you can run into when there's bad team names, because there wasn't any mechanism put in place to actually put structure around the name. And you want to think about that when you're rolling teams out, to make sure that there's some governance and control around what's a good team name, and give guidance to people around that. Another common challenge we're seeing is that people can create a team. If there's no controls around teams in your organization, you can create a team, you become the owner of that team, you can decide who the members are. People don't think about the fact that when they're a member of a team and an owner of a team, they're responsible for content that's in there. They should also be responsible for who has access to that content. And you also want to think about the life cycle of the team. The owners are basically responsible for that life cycle too, so they should be responsible for how long that team is alive, whether it needs to be removed. And if that person has left the company, for example, and you've new owners, you've basically lost that kind of control over the team itself. So you want to think about that as an organization, making sure that you've got some control around the teams. Another common issue that we see is too many members on a team. So, and this depends on the requirement for the team and what it's being used for. But you've got to think about and give people guidance as to what's a good number of people for a team. Don't be adding everybody to teams that they don't need to be in, because as teams roll out across your organization, you'll find if you're in too many, you're getting a lot of notifications. You're also getting, you're having challenges finding the teams that you actually want to be involved in. And you'll also find that if there's too many members on teams, there is the concern that they're going to have access to content that may not need to have. And there's a requirement there to be basically managing the access to the content and who's got access to it. Another issue is really, and this is more around training, is what we've seen is where people are using teams instead of channels. So you've got a team for your functional unit or your department, and rather than creating a channel and affecting that team for a subgroup that wants to get together and collaborate on a piece of work, they're creating another team. And you're finding that your organization, basically, you're spinning up SharePoint sites that are empty. They're not really being used because it's just used for a conversation. They're spinning up other services across your ecosystem in terms of Microsoft 365 that basically lay empty in effect, and it's all for the purposes of just having a conversation. Channels really are the place for that for people within specific business units and departments. So let people think about that and be aware of that fact. Disconnection of teams is a common issue as well, particularly where there's not thought given to how teams get rolled out. You want to be thinking about, from a taxonomy and information architecture perspective, when you spin up a team on its own, it's basically just in there. People get to it via the Microsoft Teams product, but you want to think about how people can get to it from other ways. So for example, if you've got SharePoint intranets, how can you make them be aware of the teams that are there and be able to find and discover those teams? And that's a common issue we see, is where there isn't any thought given to discovery of teams that get rolled out across the organization. And it's a challenge for your users then, because they're not actually aware of teams that exist, and they will start to create new teams, basically, that mirror teams that are already there. And that kind of brings us on to the next challenge, is where we see a lot of issues where we get duplication of teams, where people are not trained to go off and look and see what's already there for teams. Or unfortunately, Microsoft have made it a bit of a feature where you can actually create a team today, and tomorrow somebody else can come along and create a team with exactly the same name, and it'll let you do it. So it'll let you create duplication of teams in terms of names. So you have a challenge there in terms of managing that, and managing that from a training perspective, but also from a governance perspective in terms of controlling, that people aren't basically creating multiple teams with the same names or the same function without checking what's already there. One great feature of Teams, and depending on the organization, this might be a downfall, is the integration it has with third-party applications. We want to control potentially that integration, particularly if you're an organization that deals with sensitive content. One of the risks you have when people are rolling out third-party applications with Teams, for example, somebody might decide to add a Smartsheet tab onto their team, or they might decide to use their Google Drive or Dropbox as a file share for the team as well. The challenge with that is you now have lost control of that content in effect. So any content that goes into those services, they've left the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. So you want to be aware of what apps people are using on the Teams platform, and also you want to be aware of what, for your organization, what makes sense in terms of letting people use those apps. Data loss is another issue, and this is actually a real one. This is one that we've seen quite a few examples of over the years. A most recent example actually is where a team was rolled out, and inadvertently they had made the team public, but they only added a couple of members, like 3 members. So the owners didn't realize that even though they'd only specifically added 3 people to the team, it was actually publicly available for everybody to see the content that was in there, and they were actually using that team to store payroll data. And it took about 8 months before somebody realized that data is actually accessible by the whole organization. So data loss is a concern both inside your organization and obviously outside as well in terms of controlling access to content externally. And it's a common issue where if you don't think about it and think about how you're setting up your teams and what sort of access people should have, it can become a challenge for your organization as Teams gets rolled out. Final kind of big issue we see with Teams, and this is probably one of the biggest, is training. It's very important that people get training on the product. There's a lot of capabilities in there. There's a lot of ways you can do wrong things by mistake in Teams if you're not careful in terms of adding too many members or setting up the team to be public when it should have been private, or actually reproducing a team that's already existing. So giving people proper training in terms of how to use the platform properly, how to discover teams, how to use channels, that's vital. And you'll find as well in terms of the policies and procedures that you roll out, you want to give people training in terms of how they apply those to teams and also make them aware of, as those policies and procedures change and evolve, what that looks like for people. So in terms of managing concerns, governance concerns, let's talk about some of the things that we get with Office 365 and also talk about how we can use some automation in fact to help us build those governance concerns and manage them. Naming conventions is a big one. When you want people to start using Teams, you want to think about from an organization perspective, what is a good naming convention for Teams? I would recommend strongly you don't leave this in the hands of the end users, because honestly, you'll get everything. You'll get people that put in very, very sensible names. You'll get people that put in complete garbage names that are unfortunately not going to be very useful. So giving people a kind of a policy and guidance to follow is useful, but even better is if you can bake that into some sort of a tool, whether it's a manual process where it's going through IT for approval, or you can actually build it into a self-service that they're choosing from drop downs to build out the team name, like business unit, type of team, whether it's a project or something else, and build those into the actual convention so that people are actually building meaningful names on those teams. And that makes them much more discoverable, and it gives you a much better degree of control over the team names and making them meaningful for people to find them. Expiration policies are key. When you think about the rollout of Teams, and we talked earlier about the fact that there's now 50 million active daily users using Teams. So you can imagine how many teams are getting created on a daily basis. People create a team with the best of intentions, they dump content into it, they start collaborating for a month, and then they forget about it. It kind of moves off, or they go off into something else, or some other project happens. And that team is just sitting there basically with that content. And if it was made public, that content's available to everybody. So expiration policies are key, and Microsoft have done a great job of giving us the capability to turn that on very easily on teams and groups. And you can bake that into products as well, like self-service tools, so you can actually let your users choose expiration policies on those. And what's nice is it's a very good experience for the owners. When an owner gets an expiration policy notice, they're notified that the team is going to expire, and I think they get a lot of warning. They get like 5 or 6 notifications of this, that this is going to happen, and they have the potential to renew the team if it's something they're actively using, and if they don't renew it, then it'll get deleted. Duplication, you can build in validation for checking for duplicates. And this is important first of all, for making sure people aren't duplicating the actual team name itself, but also making sure that you're not duplicating purpose of teams across your organization, so that you're not actually reproducing or reinventing the wheel when somebody already has something that's out there. When you think about governance controls and controls that you want to think about over the content and also over things like expiration, you want to think about enforcing an owner count on your team. So you want to make sure that you have more than one owner on your team, 2 to 3 owners at least. And one of the key reasons for that is expiration is a key reason. Expiration policies, when they fire, they will go to the owners. So if you've only got one owner on a team and that person leaves the organization, for example, now you're kind of that policy notification is not going anywhere. So you want to enforce an owner count and put some validation in there around that, so that you're making sure that you've got multiple owners on the team, and as people roll off that team, that you're increasing that owner count. Teams templates are vital. People don't give these a lot of thought, but you want to think about it from a perspective of, as your organization is using Teams, what makes the most sense for them? So for example, if they want to use the team to manage a specific project, do they need to actually be managing tasks on that project? So should you be spinning up a planner for that as well, and adding a planner tab. Is there other specific tabs within that team that they should be using? Are there specific apps that you want to deploy in there to use? So think about, from a Teams templates perspective, you can set up teams as different departments want to use them, and actually make those a choice that people can take when they're actually requesting a team, that it will spin it up with that template basically, and they get those capabilities out of the box then in the team that they're going to be using. Data loss prevention, Microsoft have, on the security and compliance piece, they've got some great support in there now for managing data and managing data loss. And they've got things like sensitivity labels, and recently they've released the capability to tag sensitivity labels against a full team. So not just the Word documents or content within it, but the actual team itself. So you can actually go in now and you can specify that you've got confidential content that's basically confidential to your organization, but it's only confidential to the executive group, for example, so nobody else should have access to that. And you can apply that to a team, so that when somebody's creating a team and they flag it as confidential, you know, it's nigh on impossible then to inadvertently share things like payroll with your organization, for example. So there's great support for that. The other way that there's great support is in terms of data loss and DLP, you can build reports on different types of data that you might see across your organization. So you could build a report for SIN numbers, for example, so that if people are storing Social Security in spreadsheets, like a payroll spreadsheet, you could have a report that's basically reporting the fact that that's there and reviewing that on a monthly or weekly basis. And basically, you know, you can prevent that data loss a lot quicker, basically. So there's a lot of good support in there for that. When we think about governance and policies and procedures that you want to apply, self-service, I think, is a key piece of that. And the reason is you want to make sure governance does not get in the way of your users going about their daily concerns and going about their daily work. And that's where self-service comes in. Is it basically allows you to give people the capability to go off and do things themselves, but it allows you to tie in these policies and procedures that we've talked about, and tie in the kind of support from the technology perspective into an automation and into an automation service like Power Platform, basically, where you can spin up a team, request it, get it approved, and automatically apply things like templates and policies, enforce owner accounts, check for duplicates, do all of that sort of stuff for you, basically. And we've touched on the reporting, but this is important for managing governance concerns. Microsoft have a ton of capability around the reporting platforms. So you've got audit log searches. So you can see when people are adding members to teams. You can see when people are changing the names of teams. You can, using the DLP services, you can report on what type of content people are storing in the teams. So you've got some great capabilities there on the reporting that you want to leverage and take advantage of, and build those into your regular governance process, basically, that you're managing and reporting on that detail. And then underpinning all of this, obviously, training is key. Like we said earlier, you want to make sure that you're providing good training for your users, that they understand how to use the platform. They're also understanding what the naming conventions are and how to choose a good naming convention, that when they're looking at the choices for team templates or for sensitivity labels in terms of how to manage the content within that team, they understand what all of that means and how to choose that, basically. So good training is key to managing governance across the Teams platform. So that's enough of me. Let's move over to a demo from Adam. He's going to show us a pretty cool self-service Teams request form using Power Platform.
Thank you very much, Richard. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I hope you're all staying safe out there. Thank you for making the time to attend this webinar. I hope what you see today will provide knowledge and insights on how to manage Teams sprawls within your organization. With that said, let's get right into it. So as you can see on my screen, we have this one user named Barney Stinson. He's from my favorite TV show, How I Met Your Mother. He's going to play the role of a requester. He's been told to submit a request for an Microsoft Teams regarding a project, let's say Project Zulu, and in this fictitious company called De Facto Not, right? And then what we're going to do is myself will play the role of a collaboration manager. So I would then receive the request, and then I would determine if it follows the practices and policies that are in place within my organization. Is this meritable to approve? If so, I'll approve it, and then the request would be handled by Power Automate. Okay, so here I am as Barney. I'm in Office 365. I'm going to click on Power Apps. Just going to go here and click on Power Apps. And then on the apps on the left-hand side, and then here I'll see the app that I'm going to make the request. So here we're introduced with a little bit of a splash page, just loading the content, and it will take Barney to a landing page. So this will represent all of the groups based by department, how many Office 365 groups have been created based on a percentage value. And then if we scroll down further below, we'll see how many of those groups are Teams enabled and do not have Teams. So they could be just using SharePoint and other services within Office 365 group. If I wanted to make a request, just click on this menu and it will open up some more information. It identified that I am Barney. This is his job title. And then he can request a group by clicking request a group. So just if this is new to Barney, he'll be informed that an Office 365 group contains the following services: Planner, SharePoint site, OneNote notebook, Power BI workspace. This could depend on how your tenant is set up, and Outlook email, and an Outlook shared calendar, right? So if I wanted to type in the name of that group, say ERP2, it will address that there is already an ERP2 group created. Maybe it's best for you to change the name to something else. You can do so by putting the URL with number 12. It still exists. Okay, let's put it as 13. And then it will say that everything's okay. This is acceptable for me for the group URL. But I did mention we're going to call this Project Zulu, so go ahead and do that. And then this would be used for a joint project with legal department and IS department. Okay. And then the privacy down below is just to indicate whether this would be public or private. Okay, so public just informs that anyone in the organization would be able to see the contents and the collaboration within this group. Private would be only the members that are within this group can work around in the space, and it's more for them. Okay, and then the description down below indicates that for the user. So if we're good, we're going to leave it as private, and then we're going to click next here. The next screen will then show you like a video player where you can click play. And what I've used here as a placeholder is just a promotional video from Microsoft's website about what is Microsoft Teams. But if you were to deploy this in your organization, maybe it could be valuable, like having your Corp Comm to develop like a training 101, or just like a 2-minute video about what Microsoft Teams is all about. Especially if this is new to your organization, they'd want to be informed about what are the capabilities that they can use within Microsoft Teams. So once I finish this video, I'm enticed, I'm hooked, I'm ready for it. I'll just turn this to on, indicating that I'm fine. I want Teams to be enabled for this group. The next section here is preferred data location. So if your organization has concerns about data residency or GDPR, for example, you're in an organization where there's some regulations involved, then you might want to have this drop down to indicate where you want your data to reside. Or maybe this is a drop down that should not be shown, and you want that to be automatically defined behind the scenes. Totally up to you. And then lastly, I did mention this is a joint meeting or a joint project with IT. So we're just going to make the department and information services. By doing it this way, what I have behind the scenes is, depending on what department you choose, certain artifacts within the services of that Office 365 would be provisioned. So in this case, we have site scripts and site designs that are being used behind the scenes, and that would provision artifacts within the SharePoint site of this Office 365 group, right? So I'm just going to click on IT and then click Next. So here's a summary. And as you can tell, this kind of goes through this request as more like a shopping cart experience. And then at the end gives you a listing of what will be created, what apps would be enabled. So you got the SharePoint, you got the OneNote, you got a inbox and calendar. And then because we indicated Teams, it will also be enabled on this group. And then down below, we've indicated that it would be private. And then because it's private, it would be secured. So we'll create the group. The group has been submitted, and I'm just going to switch over to the manager side, which is myself. And how the request is being stored is in a SharePoint list. So if we go to IS projects, and then we go to this SharePoint list called group directory, we should see Project Zulu added to this SharePoint list, right? So would be the first one on the top here. And shortly, this should trigger Microsoft Power Automate, which is this one. So it is running. If we wanted to go into that instance, we can see that there's already actions being taken in place. We got the trigger when an item is created. We're getting the information of that list item, which is really the O365 group info. And then we're getting all of this client ID, secret, and tenant ID. This is being captured using an Azure application registration. And we create that beforehand to grant consent to the Microsoft Graph. This is where we're doing all of that heavy lifting, where we want to make the request to get more info about the Office 365 group, and also enabling Teams and granting permissions for that owner and for the requester. Right. So it's sitting at Request IS Collaboration Manager approval right now. If I move over to my email, I should see it that the Collaboration Manager, myself, has received this request. If I wanted to know more info about it, I can click on the link of Project Zulu. It will take me to the list item in that SharePoint list. And as I scroll through, if I see anything that's not right, if it all makes sense, then I'll go ahead and approve it. Talk to Barney at the hallway. I'm fine with this. And then click submit. Okay, so while this is going on, pretty sure it's just internet connection. Ta-da. If you go to the run history, you should see that it's been executed successfully. Yep. And we should eventually get to this IS Collaboration Manager approval response. Yeah, eventually. I'm going to go back and see if I can get into there. But while that's waiting, while we're waiting on this piece, we can see we can see the.
Could you show us the run history for when you ran earlier, Adam?
Sure. You can see the other one that was previously run. So this guy here. It would go through this logic. So it will determine, is the approval approved or what's the response of the approval? Is it true or false? If so, then we're going to make that call to the Microsoft Graph to get the token, and then get the information about the group, and then we're going to create the group. At that point, once we have that information, then we can grant the initiator who made that request permissions. That person will need owners and member privileges. This is what I've noticed in the past when we've run this, that they need to also have these two permissions. And then if they do have teams enabled in that request, then we'll also make a call to the graph to enable teams. And if they define a department, then we'll make a call to the site designs to be applied to that SharePoint site. Okay, so just gonna go back here. Okay, it looks like it did get succeeded, the one that we just made 4 minutes ago. It did go through and granted the flow initiator and the collaboration manager access. It did enable teams. It did apply the site design, and then it did notify that the group was created. So if I go back to Barney Stinson and then go to his mail, we should see that we got a request or email notification that Project Zulu was created. So if we click on the hyperlink, we should see that Project Zulu was, the SharePoint site has been created. We see that the branding of the information services, which is an orange color palette, has been applied. The deliverable documents, artifacts, site artifacts has been provisioned. And this is done by site designs and site scripts. If we click on this cog icon here and then click on site designs, we should see that this was this ran successfully. And I intentionally wanted this to be false to cause an error, just to show what would happen. So this is using site designs is a great way. It is no different than what you would do in the past, where you would save a site as a template. This is just another approach. What I like about this is it gives you like an indicator of progress, if you will, of all of the items that will be applied to that site once you click provisioning. And then at least it's applied to that hub site. So we chose information services and it's all grouped within there. If we click on the second link, I'm just gonna click cancel and then use the web app instead. We would see Project Zulu in our listed teams. So I can go further into this by adding additional channels and then changing the settings of how the Project Zulu would be created for IS. But we can expand on that enhancement as well. If I move over to the collaboration manager side of things, this would be shown also on the SharePoint Admin Center, that it's listed as well. Okay, and then to be aware of all of these Microsoft Teams, it's always best to use the reporting functionalities on your Admin Center, and also take advantage of your Teams Admin Center for usage, so that you can see what is the growth of your, whether you're rolling it out on a 30-day window, how much of adoption you're getting out of this. So these are great ways to have that visibility and transparency of the growth within your organization. So this approach could be considered amongst other approaches on how to tackle team sprawls in any automated, consistent fashion. Organizations will differ on how they use Microsoft Teams and all other services that are associated to that Office 365 group that makes up a team, whether its purpose is for internal projects, external projects, social committees, or other means. Hopefully this demo provided ways on how to manage Microsoft Teams. Once again, thank you all. This now concludes the demo. I'll pass it over to Richard.
Thanks, Adam. Really good demo. And I think that gave everybody a good idea of what the capabilities are for Power Platform to allow you to actually build a self-service solution. So let's just talk about, from Adam's demo, let's just talk about the technologies that he actually used there and just cover them again, just to kind of summarize that demo. So first and foremost, there was a SharePoint list at play there. So there's a SharePoint list basically with some custom fields on it that's basically managing those Teams requests that people are putting in. And then Adam had built a very slick kind of wizard-like Power App in front of that list that guided your users through the process of creating the team name and picking what department they wanted it to belong to, all of those details. And that Power App then will write those details back to that SharePoint list. When an item gets created on that SharePoint list, then Power Automate kicks in, and Power Automate is basically triggered based off of new items being added to the SharePoint list. And then it goes off and runs through the process of getting its authentication details for being able to call Graph API. And based on those details, then it will go off and make those calls, run through an approval process, get the approval. Once that's approved, go through and do the rest of the work using the Graph API and the SharePoint REST API to create the team and the SharePoint sites. And the final piece to think about in terms of this puzzle is Power Automate is running under, it runs under a user account. So if you wanted to be able to call things like Graph API, you do need to have the capability for it to do an OAuth connection to the Graph API. And you do that by basically spinning up, registering an app in Azure AD that gives you that kind of OAuth credentials. And then it uses those credentials to basically be able to call the Graph API. So those are kind of the four key components of that solution. So let's just talk about, and one of the things that can get a bit complicated, and it's unfortunate, but Microsoft have made it kind of complicated over the last year or two, is licensing considerations for a solution like this. So you want to think about, from a licensing perspective, when you're using Power Automate, what connectors you're using in Power Automate is what's key and what drives the license. SharePoint REST API is actually something that comes as a standard connector, so that's standard. When you want to use things like Graph, particularly making HTTP requests to the Graph API, you're talking about premium connectors then. So when you want to do things with Power Automate with Graph, unfortunately, you do need more than your standard Office 365 license to do that. You do need a kind of a per user license applied to that. So one of the ways that can get expensive, if you've got a large organization where you want to roll out a self-service solution using Power Automate, you don't want to be giving everybody a per user license on top of their 365 license if you don't have to. And one of the ways you can kind of get around that is by basically applying a kind of a service account that handles the Power Automate piece. So you could apply a per user license to a service account, and that service account is managing the list piece of it, so that when new items get added to that SharePoint list, that's been triggered, and then it runs the Power Automate piece to go off and spin up the SharePoint site. So just be aware of that, that fact that premium connectors in Power Automate do require extra licensing up on top of the Office 365 license, what it gives you. The other thing I would caveat with is, and we've seen this as well, is that people come up with very convoluted solutions in Power Automate and potentially Azure to try and get around licensing issues or licensing costs that they might run into when rolling out solutions. So just be careful when doing that as well. Because what you can find yourself running into is it may well have made way more sense to spend, the money on a per user license or even use a per app license, which is, you're paying more to run that particular Power Automate flow, but it's just a cost that you're paying per month for that flow, and that might be a lot cheaper than actually coming up with a pretty grand architecture to try and get around the licensing concerns that you might run into, particularly if they get complicated and you have to go off and refactor them on a regular basis. That can become expensive. So just be aware of that from a licensing consideration perspective. The other thing we're going to talk about is then, that's a great solution what Adam showed us there. How could you extend it? So a couple of ways that you could extend that is dropping a checkbox in or a drop-down list there for expiration policy. So having a default expiration policy of 6 months, for example, and then allowing your users to choose what the expiration policy should be on that content. Adam's solution was basically checking that SharePoint list for duplication. So he was checking to see if there was duplicate lists or team already created based on that SharePoint list. You could actually extend the PowerApp to make calls to the Graph API. There would be licensing considerations for that, but you could do that to actually check for duplication. So it's actually going off to check if there's already a Microsoft 365 group set up somewhere else with the same name. Adam showed us kind of how he was using site designs to deploy the SharePoint site based on the team creation. So customizing the backend SharePoint site is a good thing you could think about doing. So if you've got specific needs for teams where you want to actually have specific project type sites, for example, and you've got key metadata that you want to be applying to content within those, or you've got particular libraries that you want to set up on those, you can create site definitions for those and site designs and actually apply those to the self-service solution. The other thing is, and we talked about this earlier in terms of governance, about the disconnection that you can have with teams. So as people are creating teams themselves, those teams are just living on their own basically, and you get at them through the Teams interface. You might want to think about associating teams to SharePoint hubs, for example, or actually building them into your navigation. And you can build automation in there to do that. So you can automatically associate it to a SharePoint hub. So people are going to, for example, the financial department hub, and then they see new teams automatically in there as a web part on that hub, for example. Team templates are a good thing that we talked about earlier as well. So the ability to actually create specific templates for teams. So automatically decide, what channels do you want to see when it's a finance team or if it's a particular project team, what apps you want to have deployed in there, and set up a template for those that gets deployed automatically as part of that. And Adam showed a great example there when he was spinning up his self-service app. You got a video at the top of the screen there. So you could think about how you could use something like that to maybe have site owner training as a video that people see, but also as the members are added in there, you could build in notifications for training or automatically sign people up for training to watch particular videos in terms of how to use the Teams product and what the responsibilities are from a governance perspective for site owners or team owners as well. So that's really kind of, just giving you some ideas of how you can extend self-service solutions. And really, from a governance perspective, just talking about how you can basically manage teams from a governance perspective, think about the policies and procedures, and then think about how you could use automation and self-service to basically streamline those policies and procedures as they're being applied to teams in your organization. So that's all I've got. So Shannon, I think we're going to go back to you for some questions if there's any.
That's great. Yeah, Richard and Adam, thank you so much. That was such an informative presentation. I know that I got a ton of great info out of that, so thank you. Yeah, so now we're going to proceed with our Q&A session. Okay, I've got one here for you guys. We're rolling out Teams right now. How do we ensure that there's an expiration policy on Teams that have already been created?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, the answer is there is ways to do that. Probably the easiest way to do that is to think about creating some PowerShell scripts that will go off and actually apply those policies across those existing teams. So when you create an expiration policy in Active Directory, it will obviously do that for new teams, but you can set up some PowerShell to actually go off and then retroactively apply it to the existing teams that have already been deployed in your organization.
Awesome. Okay, I have quite a few questions here from Maria, so we'll try to work through these ones. Great questions here. Is it possible to sync existing SharePoint sites to Teams?
Okay, that's a good question. So the answer is sort of. So where we've seen scenarios like this is where we're typically doing migrations from SharePoint on-prem, for example, into SharePoint Online, or where people have actually been using SharePoint for quite a bit on SharePoint Online, and they've rolled out quite a lot of sub-sites, sub-teams, basically in SharePoint. And the way we've addressed this in the past is where we have basically done, we've kind of scripted it out. So we've built an automated process around those existing SharePoint sites where we actually spin up a new team for that site. We migrate over the security, we migrate over the content in effect, and then you basically have a new team, and then you archive off and delete the existing SharePoint site. And you want to automate that, especially if you're dealing with hundreds or thousands of sites. You want to automate that process so that you can make it something that you can manage and basically just kick off as a process to run over time.
Awesome. Great. And then a follow-on question was how difficult to migrate hundreds of sites?
Yeah, I mean, it's really that approach I just talked about is what you would probably do for hundreds of sites, and that's something we've done. Is building. You want to build automation. You don't want to do that manually. Is what I recommend. I mean, if you think about the core aspects of what you're trying to do there, you want to be creating a team, and you want to be migrating your content over, and also migrating the security over from the old site to the new. So the best way to do that, to guarantee that it's successful and reduce the risk, is really to automate it, so that you've got a process in place that can just loop through those sites for you basically and do that automatically.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I've got a question here from Greg. Do all the capabilities you've shown today extend to Teams Mobile?
Yes, they do. That's a great question. And actually, Adam's self-service application, I believe, that will run on mobile devices as well. So it's not just a desktop application that you can call in your browser. You can use that on mobile. And Teams itself, then, in terms of the governance policies and procedures we talked about, they all extend to Teams Mobile too. So as you're using Teams on your mobile phone, you'll encounter the same policies, procedures, and guidelines on there too as well.
Okay. Okay, great. Here's one. Bad team names. What's the best practice for that?
Yeah, that's a tough one because honestly, it depends on your organization. You got to think about from your perspective, from your organization's perspective, what is it you want to try and do with Teams? So is it something that you want to make a collaboration platform for business function, for business units in your organization, for departments? And if that's the case, then it makes sense to basically build that into the name, and also build in the type of teams that you want people to be using. Or do you want them to be specific to actual projects, so have project names on there? So honestly, the honest answer is it depends, and it just depends on what the requirements are for your organization. There isn't a good answer, but one thing I would say is do think about building in, if you can, building in a kind of a choice from the user's perspective in terms of drop downs where you can have prefixes on the team names, and then maybe give them a title that they can make more generic in terms of the function that they're trying to apply there.
That's a good suggestion. Okay, so here's another Maria question. Is it possible to use SharePoint template with SharePoint Designer workflows and sync to Teams?
SharePoint template with SharePoint Designer workflows and sync to Teams. So I'm not sure if the question is really, can we have SharePoint Designer workflows applied on Teams in terms of the libraries, or if the question is whether we want to use SharePoint Designer workflows to actually spin up a team.
Yes, I'm not sure.
Sure. Well, you know what? I'll make an assumption that the question is really if they could use SharePoint Designer workflows to spin up teams. I'm trying to think. I mean, you could. I'll be honest. I think technically you probably could, because you can make HTTP REST calls from SharePoint Designer workflows. I don't know if I'd want to do it that way. Honestly, I'd probably want to use Power Automate to do it rather than SharePoint Designer workflows. I think that you'd find that it's a much easier process using Power Automate, in all honesty.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay, here's another one. I'm on SharePoint on-prem. Can I still use a Power Platform to automate Teams creation?
So well, there's a couple of points to that one. Yes, you can use Power Platform with on-prem. You will have to deploy an on-prem data gateway to allow Power Platform to work with your on-prem environment. The other aspect of that question is, though, you need SharePoint Online though to use Teams as well. So you could have SharePoint on-prem for sure, but you want to have SharePoint Online because one of the key parts of a team is the SharePoint site, and that doesn't support SharePoint on-premise, unfortunately.
Okay. Okay. And here's one other question. How do I find out if Power Automate is included in my Office 365 subscription?
Probably the easiest way is to check when you're in Office 365 and in SharePoint, is to check the waffle on the top left and just see if it's activated for you. So see if you're seeing it there. Now, even if you don't see it in there, if you don't see Power Apps or Microsoft Flow, it may well still be, you might be licensed for it, just might be disabled. So you would want to have a conversation with IT just to see if it's something you can get activated.
Okay. Okay, that's great. That looks like all the questions we have. If there are any other questions that people want to throw in right now, we have a couple minutes to take them. Okay, excellent. I've got another one here. Is there a tracking list of Teams approval that is public?
A tracking list of Teams approval. Adam, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. But the way I understand Microsoft Flow will work in terms of approvals is those approvals stick around for 30 days and then they disappear. So if you want to be managing and maintaining a kind of a auditing capability of those approvals, you can use Office 365 Admin Center and build some auditing out of that, or you can actually make it a part of your Power Automate piece and the flow that Adam demoed, and actually start saving that detail to another SharePoint list somewhere, so you're keeping that data for a longer period of time.
That's correct. Like this, the approvals don't last as long. It's only for a certain window. So if you need to preserve those history, you can export it to a different location or duplicate it to a SharePoint list or whatever means. Maybe even like common data service, you can have that stored as well. It all depends on how your organization would tackle these approvals.
Great. Well, I think that's it for the questions. So this concludes today's presentation. So you guys could reach out to us regarding this presented material today. We'd be happy to answer any additional questions. Thank you again, and we'll hope to see you at our next webinar. Enjoy your day.